Good morning. Welcome to another episode of Tea, Coffee, and Torah, episode 10. I'm glad you are with me this morning. I have something that I'd like to share with you that totally revolutionizes the way I understand Scripture. I know each of us are seeking truth. We're trying to find the right way. We're trying to return to ancient paths because it's really in that original understanding that we gain wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. If we take a phrase or a text 100 years later and apply a more modernized understanding to it, we lose out on what the author originally intended. So I'd like to show that with you today regarding Isaiah 66, a text that I think has been severely misused. And it's misused because the original understanding, you have to have been there. You have to have lived there. But we're able to reconstruct that. We're able to understand what that is today simply because we now have ancient texts from Hittites and from other nations that give us the cultural understanding on which the Bible is written. So with Isaiah 66, I do have a couple questions for you. Have you ever read something in Scripture and felt like, and after you've read it, you go, something is missing here? Or maybe it seems like the person to whom this passage is being addressed, like the message is incomplete. Well, your intuition is actually correct. And unfortunately, what scholars and we as people who seek truth, those of us that study Scripture, one of the things that we do is we'll try to make the text very, very relevant to ourselves. But in doing that, we modernize it and we more or less erase the historical setting that it was based on. So one of the things that translators do when they don't understand a text is they will add words that make the text make sense in the text itself. So in other words, if you have a text, say I'm writing something based on Star Wars, and I say, may the force be with you, or I use different phrases from, say, a movie. If you have no understanding of that movie, you're not going to have the cultural context. But if you're working with a book and you're trying to make that text make sense within the book, you're just going to simply look probably to the Israelite law code. You're going to look to within the book of Isaiah itself to make that text make sense. Well, if what makes that text make sense comes outside of the text, maybe from other cultural practices. We saw last week that Moses was addressing Gilgamesh and the ideas in Gilgamesh that, it's too hard. You can't do it. And ideas that nobody has to go beyond the sea to get it for you and do it for you. You can actually do it yourself. So Isaiah really follows in this venue of addressing pagan ideologies, pagan philosophies, pagan doctrine. And we totally miss this because we don't have the historical text. And I am gratefully indebted to archaeology and to all of these studies that have been published through the years that are dealing with and restoring our ancient understanding or our modern understanding of an ancient text. So we're just going to delve right into this. So the first thing that it is so important to understand with Isaiah 6 is going to be the historical setting. Isaiah 66, is written at a time when Judah is being accosted by Assyria. A Sennacherib had come into the land. He had vanquished the land. Lachish had been deported. According to the Assyrian records, 250,000 Jews had been deported by Sennacherib. So Israel had lost. Israel was a defeated army. And that context really changes everything for the understanding of Isaiah 66. So Isaiah 66 verse 1 begins with this question regarding the temple. And this is another text. We're not going to get into it today. We're probably going to get into it either Friday or Monday regarding the temple and the footstool. But what I want to focus on is going to be on verses 2, 3, and 4. So I'm just going to jump in and read it to you. It says, "For all these things my hands have made, and those things have been, says Yahweh. But to this man I will look, even to him that is poor and of a contrite spirit, and trembles at my word." So this is establishing a man, if a man fulfills these qualifications, he's humble, he's contrite, he trembles at Yahweh's word, well then Yahweh's going to look to this man to do something important, to do something. Now, originally there was probably either a break in the text. I had a call come through. There was something that was, there was some indication in the text that indicated a break or a contrast, because this next verse, verse 3, is very difficult to understand. And I want you to focus, as we read verse 3, on the phrase "as if," because the phrase "as if" does not appear in the original Hebrew text. It is what translators have put in there to make the text make sense within context. So this is what it says: "He that kills a bull, as if he slays a man. He who sacrifices a lamb, as if he cut off a dog's neck. He that offers oblation with swine's blood. He that burns incense, as if he blessed an idol. Just as they have chosen their own ways and their own abominations, their soul delights. So I will choose their delusions and bring their fears upon them. Because when I called, none did answer. When I spoke, they did not hear. But they did evil before my eyes and chose that in which I delighted not." So the context here is that in verse 3, a man is choosing that which Yahweh does not delight in. But the phrase "as if" totally changes our understanding, because it makes it appear that verse 3 is actually tied to verse 2 and this man to whom Yahweh is going to look. But it's totally different. It changes it to the opposite meaning, because what we find is that Isaiah is actually quoting from a Hittite ritual for when an army has been defeated by its enemy. So, and this is totally lost because the translators, they look at this text and they're going, wait a minute, the Torah doesn't say anything about killing a man, in the context of ritual sacrifice. Of course, pigs are totally outlawed. So this appears at face value to be a contradiction until you have the cultural understanding to kind of break it down and understand how it should be applied. So let me read this phrase to you in verse 3 without the "as ifs" and put it back into its historical context. So this is what it states. Ancient Hebrew didn't have commas. I would assume that, the readers of the day, because they're very familiar. Hold on, I've got to grab my cup of joe here real quick. My throat's getting dry. But because they're very familiar with these rituals, you don't have to understand things. You're very condescending when you explain things to people that they already understand. Like, I don't have to explain to you what a book is. I don't have to explain to you what a computer is. And if I am, unless you're 3 or 4 years old, I'm really not respecting you, because I'm talking down to you and explaining things that you already know. So this is what Isaiah is doing. He's simply quoting a very, very well-known ritual among the Canaanites, left over, inherited from the Hittites, that would have been very popular during his day. And this is what verse 3 says: "He who kills a bull, slays a man, he who sacrifices a lamb, he who breaks a neck of a dog, he who offers a grain offering with swine's blood, he who burns incense blesses an idol." Totally different context. Totally different context. This whole verse 3 is about idolatry. It is about the practices of idolatry. And this is why verse 4 goes on to say that I will choose their delusions, because they chose what I did not delight in. They chose their abominations. And then you go to verse 5, and I encourage, we'll get into this later this week, but if you look at verse 5, the contrast comes back to mirror verse 2 in the man that Yahweh will delight in, and those that hear and tremble at the word. And then you go back to verse 6. So you see it kind of goes back and forth to a voice being heard from the temple that renders judgment and recompense. So there is a back and forth, an interplay with this text that we miss because translators try to make it make better sense. Now, I want to read to you the text that Isaiah is quoting from. And I'm not claiming that Isaiah is quoting from this particular Hittite text, because the Hittites were pretty much eliminated from the land around 1200 BCE. But their cultural practices remained relevant in Canaan. They were inherited by the Canaanites, and we see a lot of their ritual practices being carried on very, very late into the First Temple period. So this is the Hittite text. I don't have the Hittite text number. If you want that, I can look it up for you. Just put it in comments. But this is what this Hittite text says. When an army is defeated by an enemy. Guess what happened in Israel? Then the following sacrifice is prepared behind the river. And notice the order in which this text lists this particular ritual sacrifice for when an army has been defeated. Behind the river, a man, a kid, which would be a lamb, a dog, a suckling pig are cut in half. Half is placed on one side of the river, the other half on the other side. Before it, one makes a door out of and I can't pronounce this word, it's halakinus wood, and pulls over it a cord. Then one lights a fire before the door on one side, and on the other side he lights a fire. The troops go through the middle, but as soon as it, meaning the troops, reach the bank of the river, one sprinkles water on them. Afterwards, one goes through the field ritual, as is custom of doing the field ritual. So notice the parallel here that we have. We have things that are mentioned in both Isaiah 66:3, as well as this Hittite ritual in the exact same order. The sacrifice of a man, a kid, a dog, and swine. Now, what is also added in Isaiah 66 is this grain offering. When you read other ancient Hittite texts, you find that grain offerings and swine's blood and wine were very, very common parts of the Hittite ritual. So it would not be uncommon to have a variation of this where there is also a grain offering. And grain offerings would have been in the form of a cake that would have been, often it was buried with the ritual. Or, when they say sacrifice, we think of it sacrifice on an altar. That's not always the case. A lot of times a pit was dug and these sacrifices were buried. So when we look at Isaiah 66, verse 3, when you find that the sacrificial items are listed in the exact same order as what they are in this Hittite ritual, and you find that the historical context is the same. Israel had just been defeated by her enemies, by Assyria. Israel had lost significant territory. 250,000 people had just been deported by Sennacherib. So with this historical context, Isaiah posts a challenge. He posts an exhortation asking, who will Yahweh look to? Who will Yahweh look to remedy this situation? And he's given 3 traits. A man who is contrite and humble in spirit, a man who trembles at the word of Yahweh. So who is this man? It's very interesting that shortly after all of this happens, the most significant reforms, religious reforms in Israel's history begins to occur under the reign of King Hezekiah. All of a sudden, for the first time in history, you have the mass, I say the first time in history, it's actually the second time in history because there was one other time. But you do find that Hezekiah begins to desecrate and tear down all the high places, all the altars, all the pagan temples. Archaeologically, we even have evidence of him taking a latrine, basically a toilet, and putting it on the altar of this pagan temple. So when Isaiah is asking, to whom will Yahweh look? he's basically asking for someone to fulfill this call, for someone to fulfill this mission that is being established. And history shows that King Hezekiah answered Isaiah's call. King Hezekiah responded, and King Hezekiah began this massive religious reform. And why did he do that? Well, he was humble, he was contrite, and he definitely trembled at Yahweh's word. And we're going to get into this more. We're going to keep unpacking this again tomorrow. I want to get into Isaiah 66 verse 1, and we'll discuss this again a little bit. But I'm wanting to keep these segments kind of short. I don't want to get them weighted down. So I hope you'll join me Friday for another episode of Tea, Coffee, and Torah as we continue to unpack this. And I hope you're grabbing your glass of tea or your cup of joe and enjoying this. And I would love to hear your comments. If you have a comment or something to add, I would love to hear what you've learned. If there's something that, a question you have, please post it in the comments below. I love the discussions. I've had a lot of people respond to me in Messenger and other ways, and I've really enjoyed it. So thank you so very much for your input, and have a fantastic day.